Nick here, and welcome to my review of Gone with the Wind. And this is a DVD that I borrowed from my university library because the film is 4 hours long, including a overture theme section, a interval, a coming back into the screen music point, and an exit music bit. This isn't the only film to do that. There are others. Oliver from 1968, for example, had an overture for a couple minutes before kickstart getting into the main titles, which this film does as well. So it actually takes 6 minutes to get into the start of this film. Oliver has an interval. I don't know if it has a coming back into the screen track. That film is not as long as this one. I don't even know if it's 2 hours. It might be two and a bit hours. I'm not sure. We'll have to check later. And then, of course, there's the exit music. So, yeah. But the thing is, with Gone with the Wind, I really think this film should have been 2 films. I think they should have done an It and turned it into 2 films. And not for, oh, get more money! Like, lots of people claim that the young adult films that are cut in 2, based on possibly the final novel of their series, and cut into 2. And while some of those, maybe it's due to profit, some of them, like Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Parts 1 and 2, are for storytelling purposes, and the same can be said for It, and also for Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, which was technically a 2-part story. It's not always due to money, although that could be a factor. Sometimes legitimate storytelling purposes are needed, and I feel like Gone with the Wind should have been 2 films. I think they should have had the first film be basically before the Civil War starts, and then it's starting up, and then the start, and we start to feel the consequences of that as it's taking place in Southern American states. This is the American Civil War, by the way, not the English Civil War. That would be a completely different story. Or any other Civil War, again, completely different story. And then the ending of part 1 would be just before the end of the war, and things are pretty much the characters are on their knees, they're at their lowest point, but they're, as Scarlett shows, she's prepared to continue, and that's basically part 1 of this film. But I think if they were able to split that into 2 films, not only is that better because we don't have to watch a 4-hour film, but it also allows both individual parts to have even more stuff in them without having to have the story even longer. Well, it will be longer, but you don't have to sit through it at the exact same time. It still could have been a 4-hour epic. It's just that they didn't have to make it 1 4-hour epic. It could be 2 2-hour epics. I say epic. That's more of a blockbuster film term. This is more of a drama. But I think they could have easily had 2 films out of the 2 separate films of 1 hour 40 to 2 hours without having to make the story drag out. I think it would have been fine. But no, it has to be a 4-hour. It has to be a 4-hour film for some reason. But yeah, as I was saying, I think it would have worked as 2 films. And part 1, as we see in the actual film, could have been Scarlett is at her lowest point, but she's prepared to carry on. And then part 2 would have followed this up, the end of the Civil War and American Civil War, and then adjusting to life post American Civil War, and then the life after that, and trying to get their way through life. And yes, this is what the film does, but like I said, I think it would work better if it was 2 films. It's pretty much 2 stories as opposed to 1. So they could have done that, and it does feel like an ending at the very end of part 1, which is good, because that's where they need to put the interval. Okay, I also have to say part 2 kind of does lose its, does kind of go all over the place when it's telling its story. Part 1 at least has some sort of a understanding of what it needs to do. There are some questionable bits, but it does essentially know what it wants to be, whilst part 2 is kind of all over the place. Basic plot is that Scarlett O'Hara is, well, she's a girl who lives on a southern states cotton mill plantation, and it's just before the Civil War breaks out. This whole issue, and Scarlett is basically in love with this guy who's not really in love with her, and he's going to marry her cousin. What's the character's names? I know Ashley's the guy. Melanine, by the way, I'll just get this out there, is possibly my favourite character of the film. She is such a great character. She is such a lovely person, and I just can't help loving the character. And sadly, in part 2, she does die in birth complications. The character does die not long before the end of part 2. The climax of the film, I should say, not too long before the climax of the film, which is it's a shame. She was such a nice girl, woman. She was such a lovely character, and I also have to say that I find Mammy, the main black servant, to be a brilliant character as well. Although I can barely understand what half the things she's saying, and to be honest, I can't really follow most of the dialogue in this film. It either goes so fast or it's delivered so quietly because the music seems to be louder than the dialogue just a little bit. And maybe this was due to dubbing, because there is certainly lots of dubbing in this film, maybe every single line, and there is a lot of noticeable points. You know how much I hate obvious voice dubbings. But one thing that practical film element that doesn't appear that much, that does kind of annoy me in some places in the older films, is rear background projection. There's not many scenes of those. I think the first one comes 15 minutes to an hour in to the overall film, so there's not much of that. It's mostly actual location work or in the set. There is not much background projection work. So I'll say that. So whilst they pretty much dub almost every line, and there is a lot of noticeable edits where it doesn't line up, especially if there's a character that sounds like they're talking, but you can't see their lips moving. But at least there is not that much background projection scenes. They actually go and film on location in some places. The film is also very dialogue-driven. This is a very dialogue-driven film, and that's another reason why I can't kind of keep up with it. It's struggle to keep up with the plot. It's trying to understand that the characters will talk quickly, or they like I said, the dubbing is not that loud. It's a bit quiet, or the music a bit too loud, or maybe the accents are a bit difficult to pass, or maybe the accents make it difficult to hear, or maybe just some of the lines themselves are just tricky to follow, let alone being able to hear them. And to be honest, there's quite a bit of weak dialogue throughout parts of the film. It can be quite weak. The characters, Scarlett O'Hara, Jesus Christ, does she go through a lot of changes in this film. This character goes through so many changes, but the thing is, I don't know if she changes that much personality. At the start, she's kind of a spoilt rich kid girl, I guess, who's in love with this guy and gets really upset over with the fact that he's not going after her. Then the Civil War starts, and she kind of accidentally marries this other guy. Well, I say accidentally, she does that just despite the other guy that she likes, but he gets killed by measles. I think it's measles, or some sort of other disease, quite early on, so she becomes an early widow, and she kind of cries about that for a bit. Not the fact that she's lost her husband, but the fact she's a widow. And then she kind of does some other stuff, and then she hangs out with her sister-in-law. I think it was Melanie's brother that she married. And so she becomes a sister-in-law, I think. But yeah, she kind of hangs around with her sister-in-law for Melanine, her love rival, I suppose, for a bit. And then Melanine gets pregnant, and and so Scarlett becomes all protective over them. It gets a bit complicated, and there's the whole war in the background, and it's affecting the city of Atlanta. And yeah, it's a struggle to see these lots of people dead or injured or wounded throughout the city, and it's quite shocking. It does make me slightly sympathetic for the Confederates for the fact that we can see it through their eyes, and the innocent people, well, I say innocent, the general public were affected by this war. I am siding with the Northerners in a historical context, because their whole anti-slavery, whilst the Southerners are, they not only do they want slavery, but they feel like they need it. However, the film does do a good job in showing the Southerners in the same light as any victims of wars. The general public always suffers. If you go back to World War II, the German people would have suffered just as much as the British people, even though the Nazis were terrible people. The German general public probably weren't all nasty people. They probably weren't all nasty fascists, or at least were only because that was their nation's culture and influence over them. They weren't the real bad guys. They weren't Hitler or whatever. And the same for other countries in other wars. You can get a feel of victims on both sides. War is never good, and you can see both sides, or whatever number of sides there are. Unless it's a people like who are completely heartless, you can sympathise and feel the effects, and that's what happens here. And it does slightly villainise the Northerners, however, it is from the Southerners' point of view. And the Northerners do some nasty stuff. Then again, the Americans did some pretty shit stuff to the local Vietnamese people during the Vietnamese War. I am siding with the Americans on that because communism bad, because I'm a capitalist, and the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam. They started that, but I can't condone stuff like the American raping local Vietnamese women. So although I think the Americans were in the right going into Vietnam, I certainly side with them more than the North Vietnamese. I do not condone them raping Vietnamese women either side of the borders. That is a big no-no. And the same is here with the northern American states being pretty much dicks in the southern states. Even if they're freeing the black people, but they're still dicks to the white people down there. So even though in a historical context I side with the North, this film does prove an insight of how the Southerners viewed them, and yeah, it does make a lot of sense. It's like I said, going back to the World War II reference, it's like Germans seeing the British or the French or the Russians or the Americans come in after many years of fighting. You've given up, you've lost, and these guys are coming in and they're taking over your territory and splitting it into 4 sectors depending on which countries. And this did historically happen, so it's kind of like that. And to be honest, this is kind of the best stuff of the film. Seeing the people's response to during the war, that's the best stuff of the film. And there is a lot of fantastic cinematography in this film. One of my favourite shots is of the camera moving backwards, showing the widespread injury field. Scarlett is running across to find a doctor to help with Melanie's baby, and there is a damaged Confederate flag. I think it's the Confederates. They were the Southerners, right? I'll just say North and South because that's just bloody easier. The Southern flag is waving and it's kind of torn throughout the battle. However, part 2 does show the post-war side and the Northerners being bastards, basically. Bastard Northerners. And there's even this one who just comes to the house trying to look for stuff, and he's just being a bit of a prick. And this is where Scarlett kills him, and this is after she's declared that she will do anything to make her family better, and you can see the effects of her family's lives as of the war causing problems, and the same problems do extend into part 2. And I do like this angle of the film. I think it does show the struggles of the characters. However, going back to part 2 being all over the place, there's so many storylines to follow in part 2. As part 1, Scarlett is basically just it's followed her love story, and then the war starts and all this happens, and she gets acquainted with this what's his name, Rhett. She gets associated with Rhett, who pops up across the film, sometimes even helps her escape Atlanta towards the end of part 1, although does abandon them to go off and fight in the army, and she has to make her way home herself with her friends. Well, Melanie, her newborn son, and the black nursemaid. By the way, I have to mention about the black nursemaid who's helping Scarlett and Melanie with the Melanie's son. I swear to God they got a kid in to do her voice because, 1930s, it was a bit of a racist time, so they could have some pretty racist themes into their films. But who did they get to voice that nursemaid character? Because she sounds like a kid. I mean, the character, she might be a teenager, but she sounds younger and more squeaky. I mean, I don't know if that's if that was a black voice dub actress, or the actress herself providing a dub for her own lines, because that does happen. But either way, her voice sounds quite childlike. I don't know whether that was intentional or not. So I just wanted to bring that up because that was stumping. But part one. But anyway, moving on back to plot. Part one, simple story, simple. Part two, okay, it's very end of the war. Life's changing. And Scarlett's trying her best to try and keep their family and home alive. And she soon marries a guy that her sister, one of her sisters, wanted to marry, and so that they could start a timber business. And it kind of goes all over the place. There's also bits where she gets attacked, and so the guy she loved tries to lead in a kind of a counterattack, which the Northerners come in and say, "Oh, you rebels shouldn't take the law into your own hands." Dude, you do know your people, or these two people at the site, did attack that woman. That's certainly at least a criminal offence, at the very least. Even under your laws, that's got to be a criminal offence. So, yeah, they're taking the law into their own hands. But you've got to remember that what the guys did there was a criminal offence, or at least it should be, and it would do under later laws established later on down the line. So, yeah, guys are making a fuss all over it, but yeah, I mean, yeah, some people did die, presumably, so he says. I mean, they could make up stories. I mean, they were the enemy. There is still kind of a north-south population kind of discrimination at the moment, just like there is a white-black discrimination. But yeah, I don't know. They're just dicks for being the sake of it. I don't. That whole bit could even have been cut. I think should have been just the attack. The guys were annoyed, but they did. Scarlett says, "Let's not bother about it. That nice black guy saved me, and don't have to worry about it anymore." And yeah, and they just skipped that bit. That would have been fine. I would be okay. I would be okay with that, especially if you've got so much else going on. But her second husband dies, and eventually she gets around to marrying Rhett, and then we get their lives together. And the next bits in particular, just I don't know. It just seems to be doing bits of. The next couple of bits in particular, around the halfway point of part two, is they just do a lot of stuff in the space of a short couple of minutes. They just do quite a lot of stuff. Rhett and Scarlett on their honeymoon, New Orleans, house, business, life. It's just, there's a lot squeezed in, and there's a lot more few second scenes that are just crammed in a few times, and they either don't go anywhere, or they feel like they could have been passed on, or maybe could even have been extended, and we could have a bit more stuff. There's so many of them. And just eventually they have a child of their own. The child is called Bonnie. However, sadly, I don't know how old she is, somewhere between the ages of 5 and 8, on a horse race, because she's supposedly going to be a great horsewoman. But after a couple of scenes where Scarlett and Rhett are arguing a bit, and also after when Scarlett has a miscarriage after falling down the stairs at one point, after Rhett and Bonnie have come back from a trip from London, sadly, Bonnie dies in a horsing accident, which my mum actually watched the scene with me, and she said there was no way that Bonnie would have died from crashing into those the jumping bits over where the horse would have jumped the pony would have jumped over. And why did the pony stop and she fell over? Why did that happen? I know the character has to die to upset our main characters, but the way it's handled is stupid. It doesn't make sense, and yeah, you might as well have not bothered. You might as well just kept the character alive. If that's going against the book, then sorry, that's just something you have to change. And if the book had her surviving, then it's keeping closer within the book. Or if there was a different method, then why not do that? Unless it was too expensive or impractical. But it's just a very silly way to do it. And to be honest, I feel very sorry for the character of Bonnie, considering how the situation her parents are in, how they're always arguing, always upset with each other, and always how they're always fighting over her and with each other, and being separated from one or another of her parents for a period of time. It must be very hard for the character for Bonnie, and she sadly has to take, and it's her who has to have the hard way out of the situation by being chucked off her own pony into the show jumping fencing and onto the ground. Come on. It's a very sad moment, but the way it's handled is just a bit silly. Sadly, this also leads to Melanine's own kind of. She's not really able to have children, but she discovers she's pregnant with her second child. She's not able to have children after the first, but somehow is pregnant again, and then this causes her to have complications as well, and she dies. And the film ends with Rhett leaving Scarlet, and she's really upset with it, and that's where we get the famous line, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," when she asks what's going to become of her. And so after that, she decides to go back to Tara, and she hopes that she and Rhett will reunite together. And the film ends there. You can see my problem with Part 2. Part 2 sort of doesn't really know what it's doing. It seems to be all over the place. It's trying to do certain points, but it kind of gets lost in itself. And there is also quite a few scenes that just only go a few seconds. They're only a few seconds long, and some of them don't go anywhere. So, yeah. As for the characters themselves, Scarlet, I think, has had quite a lot of a character change, but she is quite a bitch throughout most of the film. She is a very... she's not a dislikable character, but there is times where she does act pretty bitchy, very selfishly. There are points where she's trying to help out others, and she does care for others, but other times she's just out for herself, and she can be quite a bit of a bitch in places. I'm not saying the character's bad, because we do get a personal struggle story, especially towards the end of Part 1, but the character herself is... but I just think the personality is a bit bitchy. I just think it should have had some sort of a bit more of an enlightening effect. It does sort of change her attitude a little bit, but she's still out for herself. I think by the end she should have just been enlightened and tried to look out for other people. Similarly, Rhett, he starts out like a likeable guy, he's a bit of a rogue, but later on he starts to be a bit less likeable. Kind of not the nicest of husbands, almost abusive, almost. I was worried it was going to go that way. He almost did, but thankfully it didn't go too far. I think it closest is some rough ups, but nothing too bad. Not really. The most harm was probably more verbal. But yeah, he's kind of annoying. He's sometimes the smartest guy, sometimes the most likable guy in the room. Sometimes he's the least likable, or the most hateable guy in the room. I think Ashley's a good character, but we don't have a huge amount of him compared to the other main characters. Melanie's a fantastic character, as I said, and also Mammy is fantastic. There's a couple of other people who are pretty good throughout their scenes. I think Scarlett's mother's kind of a bit of a cold-hearted character when we're first introduced to her. And I think we could have had a bit more of her before Scarlet sees her passing, so it could be a bit more impactful. The other two sisters also should have had a bit more screen time to develop their personalities. The older of which is annoyed that Scarlet marries the guy she wanted to marry, and pretty much tricks the guy into thinking that she was going to marry somebody else because she got fed up with waiting, whilst that wasn't the case. Scarlet wanted to get in with him. Scarlet married him just so that they could have the business. So that pissed off her sister, the second sister, the middle sister. The younger sister gets even less stuff to do. She's basically the voice of reason, but only in a few scenes. I would have liked to have seen that one a bit more. She could have been the voice of reason if we had more scenes of her. A kind of the character who got enlightenment, possibly, but that's only briefly seen in 2 scenes. We also see the father, but he gets a few scenes. I do like how he's kind of the effects of the war and his wife dying do kind of cloud his mind. However, again, he also dies after falling off the after being thrown from his horse into the fence or over the fence, or whilst it's jumping over the fence. And with him, I can actually understand him dying more because he's an older man and he's had a traumatizing experience, and I think he may have just been better for him to be put out with his misery. So it actually makes more sense him dying. However, when it comes to Bonnie, it doesn't really make a lot of sense unless she died from her injuries, but that wouldn't be immediate. Unlike her grandfather, where it was more likely to be immediate than her. A couple of other servants, they're good. A couple of other guys, they're right. Some doctor guys. It's not an awful lot. It's the main character's quite focused on, especially Scarlet. And to be honest, I wish Scarlet was the main character, but Rhett is put first. The actor of him is put first. Well, I don't know why Scarlet couldn't have gone first, because she's the character we focus throughout the majority of the film. Rhett's the second main character. Why is she not credited first on the main credits? I think she should be. She's the main character, so she should be credited first. As for visual style, cinematography, as I mentioned, is amazing. There's a lot of great shots, especially early on and in the first act. Second part, there isn't as much great cinematography. Well, at least not enough to rival part one. But I do think it is handled well. Dubbing, oh god, let's not go there. Music, composed by the same composer of King Kong, 1933, by the way. Really great. Although, apparently they were the 11th and 2nd greatest scores of all time, as compiled by List. I would not say either were 11th or 3rd. I mean, it's a good score. It's a very good score, but not really anything that stands out. Some of it's so loud you can't... Well, some of it's loud enough for you not be able to hear the dialogue that easily, or the dubbing was too quiet. And I don't think this one kind of sticks out. And yeah, I wouldn't quite consider it one of the best scores of all time. It's good. It's a good score, but I wouldn't consider it number 2. I would not consider it second best of all time. And King Kong, again, I wouldn't consider that 11th, but that was certainly a very good one. Especially, I gave him a lot of credit in that review. I gave him a lot of credit in my review for his... in my King Kong for 1933 review, I did give him a lot of credit for his music, as he did a great job. I just wouldn't consider it the 11th greatest score of all time. And yeah, lots of great locations, and I think they've done a great job in the direction. It's so difficult to hear some of those lines sometimes, and it's so dialogue-based. I think they should have made it less dialogue-based. In books, it makes sense, but in a film... I think this is something they're going to learn later, and I think this is something filmmakers learn later down the line, or script makers at least, is to have less dialogue in film. More dialogue-centered stuff is more suited for radio, for the most part, as film is a bit more of a visual experience. Although you can have lots of talking in films, it's also good to have some quieter moments, some moments of non-talking. And you can get some great visual reactions and some great facial or body language throughout. You can have some great stuff for that, and you can display a lot of that through those, as you can vocal emotions with these characters. And I think we do get some of that, but it's just lots of talking. There's a lot of talking, and some of it isn't even that interesting, to be honest. In fact, quite a lot of it isn't even that interesting. What I meant is that quite a bit of it doesn't quite relate to the story, and when it does, it's still difficult to follow. So, all in all, Gone with the Wind, I like it, but I really think it should have been 2 films. I really think it should have been cut in half and done as 2 separate films, 2 hour and 40 minutes to 2 hour long films. It would have been fine that way, but no, we've got a very long film, which makes it quite difficult to sit through. And with the dialogue problems, that doesn't help. And whilst the cinematography is great, it's a great film, but the story doesn't quite 100% work. That's why I think it should have been 2 stories. And I think out of the 2, I think part 1 would have been the better half. because part one, as it goes along, it starts to explore the elements of the story that it has decided to take on, and I think it does that really well. Part two, on the other hand, starts getting a bit lost and confused with itself as it goes along, and when it does know what it wants to do, it still kind of gets itself a bit lost when trying to tell that story, whilst part one seems to know what it's doing. So yeah, it is two different styles of the same story, or at least the parts of the story as we go along. But on the whole, Gone with the Wind, good film. I just wish it was films rather than I wish it was two rather than one, because yeah, it's just too long for one story, just too long. And there could have been stuff that they could lose from both parts, especially part two. They could have lost some stuff. So on the whole, I'm going to give Gone with the Wind an 8 out of 10. With the length and the dubbing and some of the not the performances, but some of the writing does kind of knock it down quite a bit for me. If it was two separate films, I think they would both be 8s, maybe 9s at a push. But certainly as the one whole film, definite 8. I wouldn't put it any lower, but I certainly wouldn't put it any higher. So that's it from Gone with the Wind. Thank you for watching. The next classical Hollywood cinema film, because this was for my classical Hollywood cinema subject. It's a module at uni. The next one will be Rear Window, which is possibly my favourite Hitchcock film. It's that or Psycho, which that is so good. I think Rear Window, out of the ones I've seen so far, has the best final scene at the very least. So yeah, and the ending's is a good ending. So which is for the Hitchcock films I've seen so far, I haven't been that impressed with the endings, or at least the very final scene. Psycho has a fantastic ending, but the final scene is when they're pulling out the car from the swamp, and it kind of cuts halfway. It cuts to the end halfway through that bit. So that's why I think Rear Window's got the best final shot, and I think the ending is pretty solid. So that's it from me. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the official Nicholas Payne Retro YouTube channel. I think they should have done an It and chopped them into two films. I think they should have done an not only could they not only would that be better, as it makes us don't have to watch a 3-hour, 40 to 4-hour film with all this. What they could have, it could still be a bit. Although help me if I can understand. Although God help me if I can You know how I dislike that type. You know how I dislike somehow. Oh yeah, it's because she married her. I think it's the brother of the girl who's marrying the guy she wanted to. I think it's Melanie's sister that she met. I think there's so much war and then there's always bloody bets. I am siding with the Northerners. I'm siding with the Northern states because their policies are right, anti-slavery, and whilst it would, or at least weren't the ones who. And the same for the communists. War, either in both sides, war. But I can understand them getting but the Americans raping women. But the Americans raping local Vietnamese. but the Americans raping local Vietnamese women is no, I can't accept. Like, similar to, and the same happens here. Yeah, I'm siding with the Northerners in historical context, but this film does prove that they were dicks in place. But the film, so even though I'm who, by the way, I have to mention, whoever voiced dubbed that character, who did they get? It would at least come under, or at least it would under later look, or at least it would be Lil. Started with a B. What was her name? Why is there something still beeping? Coming back to this. See how much more we can do. Okay, sorry for that, but I had to go and switch off the dryer. Okay, but she's still kind of a bit of a but she's still a bit of a bitch throughout quite a lot of the film, especially in the but she's still quite a bit of a bit. I think she should have grown, and I think she should have grown a bit more throughout the film. I think it should have affected her more. And whilst we sort of do see that, I think it should have changed her personality and not just her methods. Actually, I'll cut that because it does. Similarly, Rhett is kind of also all over the place. One of them, of course, really hates her sister for the fact that she goes after her man, and for the fact, excuse me, the first of all, leaves nothing to rival, or at least not much to rival the first one, or at least not much to rival. But part 2 starts. However, part 2, on the other